Recently, I was thinking about some of the bad movies that I really love, and it got me thinking about something else. I got to thinking about the phrase guilty pleasure. I started wondering about where the term comes from, how it was used originally, and how it's used now. I'm a writer. I get curious about stuff like that. Plus, I was really bored. It also got me thinking of several movies in particular that I might consider a guilty pleasure of mine. There are many of them, but today I want to talk about one in particular. It's not a great movie. I don't care. I love it to pieces. This is going to be very different from my last essay because in that one I talked about all the reasons I disliked a poorly put together movie. And in this one, I'm going to talk about all the reasons I love an earnest but slightly clumsy movie. With all stories that I consume as a reader, as a film fan, as a writer, I like to analyze why stories work for me personally and why they don't. I like looking at stories that way because it teaches me about the kind of writer that I want to be and the kind of stories that I want to write. There are some stories that fall under that category and ones that just really, really don't. And today, while I talk about this one particular movie, I also want to talk about where the phrase guilty pleasure comes from, the idea of it in modern pop culture, and why I don't like it. So first, let's explore this sweet, under the radar movie called Letters to Juliet. So let's do a quick summary of this movie for those who haven't seen it. The main character's name is Sophie. She's a fact checker for The New Yorker, but she's a writer at heart and would one day love to write for The New Yorker. She goes on a pre-honeymoon to Verona, Italy with her fiancé Victor, who is a chef and likes to talk with his hands and pretend that he's Italian. Victor decides to use a majority of his time on their pre-honeymoon to find vendors of authentic Italian ingredients for his soon-to-open Italian restaurant back in New York, leading him to kind of neglect his fiancée Sophie. From the looks of things, Sophie's pretty used to his work being most important. Being bored with coming along on search for vendors and the perfect cheeses and truffles, Sophie decides to explore Verona on her own and sightsee. She stumbles upon a hidden local treasure, Juliet's Verona courtyard, where there are tons of tourists leaving letters on the wall and crying and stuff. She sees a woman taking these letters down from the wall and putting them in a basket. And after some sleuthing, discovers that these hundreds of letters, these letters to Juliet, are typically answered by the secretaries of Juliet. Basically, they are Juliet, and they give people life advice, especially about love. She finds these secretaries answering letters and asks to join them, telling them she was curious about it because she's a writer. They welcome her with open arms. While back at the wall, Sophie accidentally finds an old, hidden, unanswered letter by a woman named Claire Smith from 1957. After reading the letter to the secretaries, she decides to answer it. Within a week, the now elderly Claire arrives in Verona with her uptight and cynical but handsome barrister grandson, Charlie Wyman. Side note, why are they always barristers? Why can't any of these English love interests just be like some normal dude from Cornwall? Claire and Sophie click immediately, but Charlie definitely does not like Sophie. I mean, he just comes at her from jump, makes fun of her American colloquialisms and everything. Charlie's a savage. Following the advice in Sophie's reply, Claire has come back to Verona to look for her long-lost love, Lorenzo Bartolini. Sophie, thinking Claire's story might help her with her writing career and has genuine interest in the story, asks if she can join them. Claire is more than happy to have Sophie along, and Charlie is Charlie. After finding one Lorenzo Bartolini nearby and realizing that he wasn't the right one, Sophie does a local search online to find that there are multiple Lorenzo Bartolinis living in the area. Sophie's determined to help Claire find her long-lost love, and Claire is more than up to the task. Charlie is Charlie. During a montage of finding various Lorenzos, with some fun times in between, Charlie finally warms up to Sophie as they get to know each other, and vice versa. After initially refusing, she even lets him read her writing. Finally, they find out that one Lorenzo Bartolini is dead. They don't know if he was Claire's Lorenzo or not, but standing over his grave, Claire still looks devastated all the same. Upset at the thought of this hurting his grandmother, Charlie argues with Sophie, says that they've had enough, and accuses her of not knowing what real loss is. Claire, witnessing the dispute, tells Charlie he was wrong and that Sophie's mother abandoned her when she was a little girl. The following day, Claire insists that Charlie apologize to Sophie at breakfast, which he does. After dinner that night, Sophie and Charlie talk as they stargaze in the grass, and they realize that this is the last night before Sophie has to leave. There's loads of tension between them. One thing leads to another, and the two kiss. But Sophie's engaged. Oh, damn. The following morning is their last day, and things are awkward between Charlie and Sophie, although that doesn't stop Claire from being sly and playing matchmaker. As they're driving through the countryside, Claire points out a passing vineyard to Charlie and asks if he could stop so they can have a farewell toast for Sophie. As they enter the vineyard, Claire sees a young man who looks exactly like her Lorenzo. Through some questioning, they discover the young man is Lorenzo Bartolini's grandson, which leads to Claire and the elder Lorenzo reuniting after 50 years. After spending some time with Lorenzo's family and having a tense, restrained conversation with Charlie, Sophie decides to head back to Verona. Claire pushes Charlie to go after Sophie, and he does. But when he gets there, he sees Sophie with Victor and changes his mind. Back in New York City now, and Sophie's decided to show her story about Claire and Lorenzo to her boss at the New Yorker. He likes it so much that he decides to publish it. Overjoyed, Sophie runs to tell Victor, whose reaction is half distracted and lukewarm. She even finds out that he never even bothered to read it, even though she gave him a copy to read. Sheesh, Victor. Sophie receives an invitation to Claire and Lorenzo's wedding back in Italy, and she decides to go alone. Exhausted by the differences and lack of passion in their relationship, Sophie breaks up with Victor. It's pretty mutual, though. Victor seems upset initially, but also says that he can't promise her that he would change. Well, at least he's honest. Anyway, that's done. Bye, Victor. We're immediately back in Italy, and Sophie attends Claire and Lorenzo's wedding. It's there that she sees Charlie again, all tailored and sharp, but he has another woman on his arm. Gasp. She spends the whole time at the wedding being simultaneously super happy for Claire and being totally crushed seeing Charlie with someone else. After listening to Claire's speech at the reception, where she reads the letter Sophie wrote to her, encouraging Claire to follow her heart, as she locks eyes with Charlie while he sits next to this other woman. Sophie bursts into tears and runs out of the reception. Charlie goes after her, and she tells him she broke up with Victor. She confesses her love for him, but tells him it doesn't matter, to go back to his girlfriend. Charlie realizes how oblivious he's been and tells her that the woman he came to the wedding with is his cousin. Oh my God, Charlie is single. It's happening. He climbs up the vine to the balcony, recreating the famous scene from Romeo and Juliet, and confesses his love for Sophie. And then immediately he falls to his death. The end. I'm kidding. He doesn't die. That doesn't happen. Wouldn't that be terrible? But he's most definitely concussed. I mean, that was a big fall. She runs to his side to make sure he's alive, and he surely is. They kiss happily ever after as Claire and Lorenzo look on in pride. Presumably an ambulance is on the way. I certainly hope so. Roll credits. I love this sweet, silly movie. It's not perfect, to be sure. Like how the scene where Sophie breaks up with her fiance, breaks off an entire engagement with him, is just perfectly sandwiched in between two other scenes that both have Taylor Swift's love story playing during them. It feels shoehorned in a way that almost makes it seem like in post-production they were like, oh crap, we forgot to add the part where Sophie breaks up with her fiance before she gets together with Charlie. Quick, put it back in. I know it's very unlikely that that's how that happened, but picturing it just makes me laugh. It literally just goes straight from the sad sounding score back to upbeat Taylor Swift. The transition is so jarring. And it makes me burst out laughing every time. I would play that clip for you here, but playing a Taylor Swift song would definitely earn me a copyright strike. Also, I don't want Scooter Braun getting any coin from my video. The vulture. So watch the movie for yourself if you want to see what I'm talking about. Even despite that funny, clunky editing, despite its predictable story, I love it anyway. I love it so much. I love how shamelessly feel good it is. Maybe it's cheesy, but I love that. This is one of my bad day movies. I could be having a terrible day, but by the middle of this movie, I have a huge smile on my face. That's what makes it so fun. I love that there's two love stories in it. I think it's cool that the story incorporated the real life romance between Vanessa Redgrave and Franco Nero. I know it's a gimmick, but it's the kind of gimmick I appreciate. I'm kind of a sap. The two have great chemistry, obviously, because they're actually in love and actually married, I believe. And I like that they incorporated a romance between two older people. You don't see that too often, and I really like that this has that. I really like Christopher Egan. I just like to look at his face and listen to his voice. So dreamy. And of course, Gael Garcia Bernal is also great. You could tell he has a lot of fun with this role. I love the awkward bits of improvised dialogue, especially the way that they sometimes interrupt each other or talk over one another. I really like that the director had the actors improvise in a movie like this. It's probably not everyone's cup of tea, but to me, it gives it this feeling of almost reality. It makes the structure feel less rigid, a little more true to life, despite it being this kind of fairy tale style rom-com. I am not a fan of stilted dialogue in rom-coms. I prefer truer to life dialogue that sounds closer to how people actually talk, even despite all of the fancy settings and familiar genre conventions. It gives a sense of laminated reality, like these things could actually happen in real life to real people. Romances are supposed to feel a little relatable like that. So I think the improvised feel really helped with that. I love Amanda's improvisational style. You could say she's just playing herself in this movie, and maybe that's why I like it. There's something about her I just find so charming. I first saw this movie on the heels of Mamma Mia. I didn't see Mamma Mia in theaters like everyone else. I don't know why. I guess I thought I wouldn't like it. I first saw it on a movie channel, and I really loved it. And I think I either saw Letters to Juliet because I borrowed the DVD from somebody, or I rented it from Blockbuster. Blockbuster. R.I.P. Either way, I got obsessed with them around the same time during the same summer when I was still in high school. At one point that summer, I was watching either movie every other day. I would sit in front of my TV with either Italian or Greek food that I made myself with a recipe from allrecipes.com, and I'd watch either one. Say I never went on vacation growing up without saying I never went on vacation growing up. But this came out when Amanda was having a huge boom in her career and basically everyone wanted to work with her. And I would say that this was one of the most underrated ones that came out in that period of time. This one and that gritty, twilighty version of Red Riding Hood that Catherine Hardwicke did in 2011, which, yeah, I was not a fan of that. But this one really flew under the radar. It wasn't a flop per se. At the box office, it went $50 million over its budget, which is really good, actually. It just wasn't really popular, and it's still pretty underrated to this day. It also had one of those weirdly stark critic audience splits in opinion. It also came out when rom-coms were winding down in popularity at the movies. Less were being made because less people were seeing them. Ones that were coming out weren't pulling the proposal box office numbers. Also, it came out only 5 months after Dear John did, and the Nicholas Sparks tragic romance formula was actually doing a lot better at the movies at the time than rom-coms were. And maybe by then, people were feeling some Amanda Seyfried fatigue. Is it Seyfried? 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 But Letters to Juliet seems to have had an extended life thanks to being available on streaming apps now. It's generally well liked by audiences all these years later, which makes me happy. Now, let's talk about where the phrase guilty pleasure comes from. The Google definition of guilty pleasure is something such as a movie, television program, or piece of music that one enjoys despite feeling that it is not generally held in high regard. According to an article written by Jennifer Zalai titled Against Guilty Pleasure, published in 2013 by The New Yorker, when guilty pleasure first appeared in the New York Times in 1860, it was used to describe a brothel. But the phrase started to become a part of cultural vocabulary around the late 1990s. In the article, Laura Frost, a professor of literary studies, says, modernists distinguished between pleasure that was too easy and the difficulties of real art, yet they were so invested in dismissing easy pleasure that they could feel righteous in their preferences. Jennifer Zalai also writes, modernism had been competing with popular culture and consequently built bulwarks against it, pushing back against anything that was accessible and easy to take in. Postmodernism doesn't have the same hang-ups. In fact, it seems to have few hang-ups at all, which is perhaps what got the moralistic culture warriors worked up into a panic in the first place. She goes on to talk about how the origins of so-called guilty pleasures and the panic in the 80s and 90s about secret satanic messaging in rap music and heavy metal music are very similar, which I find really interesting. She also writes at the end, "The guilty pleasure is a vestige of America's disappearing middle-brow culture, of that anxious mediation between high and low," which I kind of agree with. It does speak to how now most art is either talked about as if it's groundbreaking and incredible or complete crap, just like no middle ground at all anymore. It's almost an extension of that old archaic view that the only real art worth consuming is the kind that makes you suffer, which in my opinion is a very dangerous thought and has lost us most of our greatest artists in history. If you're interested in reading that article, I linked it down below in the description box. It's a good read. These days, guilty pleasure, I'm going to try not to use so many air quotes. Filming this video, in my script, I have quotes written around the phrase guilty pleasure because of how much I hate it. But I'm going to try not to do too many air quotes. I'm very sorry. These days, guilty pleasure has all sorts of connotations attached to it. One, which is the worst in my opinion, is the implication that if something is a guilty pleasure, then when you consume it, you're not being productive in some way and you're wasting your time. Productiveness as a virtue is a load of bullshit. The other connotation that isn't great is the idea that what you consume defines you, which I'll admit up front, I do that sometimes myself. I think that's a big aspect of modern fandom. I mean, I love talking about art that I like, but when it becomes this negative thing, like other people telling you that you have bad taste, like what does that even mean? And why does that matter? I mean, I think when it's a joke between friends, that's fine. Personal taste is one thing, but there are people out there that honest to God view others according to their tastes. Have you seen Stan Twitter? If you haven't, lucky you. Even some people conflating your morality and even your worth as a person with what your personal taste is in things. Like, what? I don't know if y'all know this, but you know, it's okay to just say you don't like something. You don't have to attach moral value to it. You can just say you don't like it. It's okay. You can do that. I promise you the world won't end if you do it that way. It's okay. In my view, the phrase guilty pleasure prescribes to that view. And that, you know, that a so-called cultural standard exists and should always be acknowledged, which I really don't like. So let's get into that a little bit. So why is it that when we love a piece of media that isn't considered high art, we feel the need to lead with a disclaimer that we know it's bad? I mean, who decides something is bad anyway? Some people love saying a show or a movie is objectively bad, but I think most times things like that are subjective. Who would even decide that so-called objectivity? I'm of the opinion that art is inherently subjective. The way we view art depends on the context that you're viewing it from and your own individual point of view. I could think that Paw Patrol is repetitive and predictable, but to a toddler, that show could be a masterpiece. The epitome of adventure. The best thing they've ever seen. I mean, sure, they haven't seen much television yet because they're babies and they've only been alive for like 2 or 3 years. But that is their context through which they're viewing this show from. And who am I to question that? It also depends on if your default way of reading or viewing art is either more paranoid or reparative. Eve Kozlowski Sedgwick, coined the terms paranoid reading and reparative reading in 2002 in her essay, Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid That You Probably Think This Essay Is About You. Yes, that is the real title. And yes, it's amazing. A good descriptor of both these terms is in these lines I read in an opinion piece called Bad Surprises, written by Olivia Liang, which I'll also link in the description box below. A paranoid reading, Sedgwick writes, is above all defensive, attempting to forestall the pain of being caught unawares. There must be no bad surprises. Paranoia requires that bad news be always already known. A reparative reading isn't lodged in the need to predict and prepare for disaster. It might be engaged in resistance or concerned with producing some other reality altogether, but it's driven by a seeking of pleasure rather than an avoidance of pain. I myself lean much more toward reparative readings just because that's the way that I like to experience stories for the most part. I normally like to examine what a story has given me, how it enriched me, how it made me feel, rather than keep tally marks of every little thing I think it should have done or every perceived slight. I think in general, people who go by enjoyment of something rather than by some so-called objective measure of taste have a much funner time experiencing stories. It must be exhausting seeking out every single flaw within everything that exists and fixating on it, especially art, because yes, art is flawed. Art is made by humans, and humans are flawed, sometimes deeply flawed. But focusing on that all the time for everything, I don't know. Can't you just let yourself enjoy things or not enjoy them and let other people enjoy things that you might not like? Sometimes it's okay to just mind your business. Both methods, paranoid and reparative, have their merits, but I think that society at large has dipped largely toward paranoid readings in the last decade or so. You know, saying this movie did blank, and here's why that means this movie is unconditionally bad. Personally, I think this is because paranoid readings of basically everything were so commonplace on a little website called Tumblr. And I think that Tumblr has had a bigger influence on society than some people are willing to admit, particularly the younger generations. I think Tumblr's influence has spread all over the internet, and not in a good way. I even see more and more old Tumblr style antics on Twitter these days, possibly because of the great Tumblr migration of late 2018. The atmosphere of Twitter is really similar to old Tumblr now. Now, I'm not going to get into Tumblr fandom and Tumblr in general here because there are plenty of videos about that on YouTube already, and I'm sure they talk about it in a way that's much better than I could do. That's not what this video is about anyway. Frankly, I don't want to poke the bear. I'm not saying this is all Tumblr's fault. I myself was on Tumblr for years. I had a K-pop blog. K-pop Tumblr was really fun most of the time. And paranoid readings have existed for centuries. It's not something that Tumblr invented. Leo Tolstoy once called Shakespeare's plays trivial and positively bad, and Shakespeare himself an insignificant, inartistic writer, not only not moral, but immoral. He truly thought Shakespeare was a blight on society, and they lived centuries apart. Imagine being so petty over another writer that you write a 100-page diss track about a guy who can't even respond because he's dead. I mean, that's like if Drake wrote a diss track about Tupac or something, which would never happen, because the rap community would tear him to pieces. His career would be over. But in the case of millennials and now Gen Z, with many of us being raised by Tumblr and the way that so many of us interpret stories and media now, Yeah, it might be Tumblr's fault. But it's also possible that a lot of us feel the need to broadcast our awareness of good taste, there go the air quotes again, because of a giant of pop culture which has become the elephant in the room. Yes, I'm talking about Rotten Tomatoes. Before anyone thinks I'm about to be like, Rotten Tomatoes bad, I don't think that's true. I like Rotten Tomatoes. I think it's a nice tool for the most part. A tool that can be abused, but we'll get to that in a second. I'm also someone that appreciates stats, and I like a good average. It's nice knowing how many people enjoy something. The problem, though, is that in the past 10 years or so, it has become the end-all be-all of movies. Television now, too. If a movie hasn't been promoted well, it will often solely rely on its Rotten Tomatoes score for anticipation and attention from audiences. And if it doesn't have a fresh score, done for. It's totally screwed. Not to mention the user score campaigns over the years, where a ton of people giving a movie a mass low rating is used as an actual weapon against it to tank its reputation. Then there's also the user ratings only based websites for all sorts of things these days. For example, this isn't for movies, but rather for books. Goodreads. Been a member on Goodreads for... God, I made my account in high school. I think I've been on there for like 12 years now. Good God. For as long as Goodreads has existed, there have always been a certain kind of reviewer on there. The kind that gives every single book they can find a 1-star rating. Basically, it's like a game to them. And sometimes they're known for writing these long, ranting reviews about how bad the book is, sometimes full of gifs and caps lock. There are tons of people that love that kind of thing. These people usually have tons of followers who follow them just to watch them trash every book they can get their hands on. And that's fine. People like what they like. Whatever. Schadenfreude. And I don't have a Letterboxd account, but I've heard that there's plenty of those kind of 1-star reviewers on there too. There's even a whole Twitter account dedicated to the chaotic reviews on there. I think it gives some people a sense of power. Maybe their lives are terrible, and so calling every YA book bad or every mainstream movie bad gives them a sense of power that they wish they had in their normal lives. Maybe they have an inferiority complex and trashing other people's work makes them feel good about themselves. Your guess is as good as mine. And maybe because that kind of thing exists online in the pop culture sphere as possibly a sort of byproduct of the guilty pleasure phenomenon, that was why I felt the need to advertise at the beginning of this video that Letters to Juliet is messy. But I love it. So why should I have to call it bad before I tell people I love it to appease people or to make myself look better? There's also the added layer of Letters to Juliet being a rom-com and rom-coms being looked down on and lumped into one single category of chick flicks. There go the air quotes. I mean, every time I do it, it's going to bother me now. Which brings me to my next segment. My hand looks weird at that angle. That's better. Chick flicks have long been regarded as inferior movies for decades, even though there have been multiple classics loved by critics and competing right alongside the big leagues in award shows. Not as much recently, but there's something to be said about when Harry Met Sally still being thought of by many as one of the best movies of all time. But because romance is largely coded as feminine, it's seen as stupid or bad. Same goes for the book categories of any kind of romance or chick lit. Oh God. It's getting bad, you guys. Maybe I should just tie my hands behind my back. But when a rom-com movie or book with romance in it is written by a man, it's seen as more legitimate or more palatable by the mainstream audience. Some examples are Forgetting Sarah Marshall, Hitch, Friends with Benefits, Crazy Stupid Love, and Knocked Up. Even When Harry Met Sally was directed by a man, even though it was written by the great Nor Ephron. In the case of most of those examples, you can tell apart the masculine gaze movies by the way that these women are portrayed, either as eye candy slash visual wish fulfillment for the presumed straight male audience, or as fully formed people with their own motivations. And admittedly, there are exceptions to romance written by men. I mean, look at Nicholas Sparks. He has a large dedicated audience, but his books have been largely panned by general audiences for years. But for literary novels written by men with romance in it, they're widely regarded as serious masterpieces, high art worthy of Pulitzers. When women write literary fiction with romance in it, it's written off as just a romance, no matter the intent or genre of the actual story. Some people even consider it to be lesser art. But Letters to Juliet was also created entirely by men, written and directed, and its current Rotten Tomatoes score sits at 42%. It is an exception to this loose observation of mine. There's something to be said about this movie feeling very feminine gaze as opposed to being a masculine gaze rom-com, despite being written and directed by men. So maybe there's a bit of a bias against feminine gaze movies, or at least maybe there used to be 10 years ago, because I do think that's changing. Another example of a femme gaze rom-com that came out around 10 years ago is Leap Year, starring Amy Adams, which not only has a huge gap in critic and audience opinion as well, but they're also very similar stories. Career woman, seriously involved with a man, travels to scenic, beautiful foreign country, meets another man in said foreign country, has adventure with other men across foreign country, and catches feelings for him and gets together with him in the end. Very similar. Interesting. I hope that there might be room for more feminine gaze movies, particularly femme gaze rom-coms in the future. Going back to literature, romance is one of the steadiest genres in the publishing industry. 1/3 of all fiction books sold are romance books. Sales from romance books exceed $1 billion per year, more than any other genre combined, which makes it an industry leader. In fact, in 2020, the pandemic actually boosted romance sales numbers in ebooks alone. I mean, that's amazing. According to Forbes, sales of romance books usually rise during times of turmoil. It really shows that last year, more than ever, people wanted happy escapism. So I really don't understand the impulse to judge someone as a person based on what genre of fictional stories they like to enjoy. Like, okay, story time. Last year, during the worst of the pandemic, I was wanting some human connection. I think a lot of people were. So of course, I turned to the internet. No, I did not make a TikTok. I had been talking to this guy I met on a dating app for a few weeks, and after I told him what book I had been currently reading, a YA romance, this dude just straight up ghosted me immediately. I mean, it was like I told him that I love to eat puppies or something. I mean, it's like he saw the words YA romance and said, oh, that's it. That's the last straw. I'm out of here. I mean, it's totally possible that, he just had something else going on. I get it. He was kind of a snob about books. I mean, he was one of those people who's like, oh, fiction is for children. I only read nonfiction. But anyway, I have never read a Tom Clancy book, and never will, because it's not at all my thing. But I'm not going to judge you if all you read are Tom Clancy books or Dan Brown or something. It actually makes sense to be a fan of Tom Clancy or Dan Brown because there are a ton of books that they've both written. Same goes for any extremely prolific writer like Agatha Christie, R.L. Stine, or Nora Roberts / J.D. Robb. Once you become a fan of their books, you're basically set for life. Same goes for genre. once you're a fan of the certain kinds of tropes that a genre has, it makes sense to keep going back to it because you know what you're getting. Some people think that a story being predictable makes it automatically bad, but there's nothing wrong with wanting that assurance, that comfort, and that little sense of predictability. That's also why the Agatha Christie type of mysteries, or cozies, have been so popular for the last century. It does not mean that you have bad taste or that your opinions on individual stories or tropes from that genre cannot be nuanced. Just means you know what you like. That's great. And why should any of us feel guilty about that? I think as a society, we've moved on from the need to have guilty pleasures, especially during a devastating worldwide ongoing pandemic that will have adverse mental health effects on all of us for years to come. Pleasure has been hard to come by for the past year and a half, and for a lot of people, media like television, movies, and books have provided some of the only respite, present company included. We shouldn't feel ashamed or guilty over anything that brings us joy, so long as it's not actively harming other people to do so. And we shouldn't have to feel guilty over having different taste in art from some random dude or person on the internet that says it sucks.
The worst movie ever! And send and sip.
And did I make an entire essay just to defend my love for the movie Letters to Juliet? Yes, I did. And I'm not ashamed or guilty about it. Hey, if you're new here, what's up? My name's Sarah. You could also call me Anne because Ann Anderson is my writing pen name. I like to talk about things that I like. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up because it helps me out and it makes me happy. I intend on making more videos because it turns out I really like making these. It won't be at all as long as this video or as long as my first video. Some of them will be shorter, so hopefully I'll be able to make them more often than like every 6 months. And down in the comments, tell me your favorite movie or book or music that you refuse to call your guilty pleasure because we're not doing that anymore, damn it. Subscribe if you want. I'm gonna make more. So long, or see you next time. I haven't decided how I want to say goodbye in these yet. I don't know. It's still a work in progress. That's it.